Hello, church. It's Monday, June the 3rd. Yesterday in church, we continued reading in Luke, the 8th chapter, and we looked at a sequence of things, kind of a broad outline of over the next 3 weeks. We're going to look at something. Starting here in this chapter, Jesus asks a sequence of 3 questions. And each of the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at one of those 3 questions. The first question he asks is in the story for today. Where is your faith? The second question he asks is, what is your name? And the third question he asks is, who touched me? And there are 3 different kind of circumstances. And we're going to explore those today. So today we're going to talk about where's your faith? And so Jesus is, he's given this kind of sermon in the parable in the beginning of the 8th chapter. And then he looks at the disciples and he says, okay, let's go to the other side of the lake. And you and I, we don't think much about it, but this is a kind of a proverbial saying, something that we might understand better if I were to tell you, all right, now we're going to go to the other side of the tracks. The sea had ethnic groups that surrounded it. There was a Jewish community. That's where Jesus was at this point in time. Then across the lake on the other side, there was a Gentile community. And so Jesus tells them that we're going to go to the other side of the lake. We're going to leave the Jewish community. We're going to deliberately go to the Gentile community. And again, this is to help us to understand that from Luke's perspective, Jesus came to change the whole world, not just the Jewish people. And so Jesus makes a conscious, deliberate effort to go into the Gentile community to bring the gospel. And so as they get in the boat, and the first thing that Jesus does, if you read verses 22 through 25, you'll find the story in there. Jesus gets in the boat and he falls asleep. But the disciples, they know they're going to the other side of the tracks. And so they're in no condition to fall asleep and relax. They're thinking about what's ahead of us. If you've ever been in a community that's not your home community, and sometimes you're a little nervous and a little anxious because the people are different from you, and maybe even afraid. And so because they're awake and they're already a little bit on edge, they notice that a storm is coming. And storms in life, there are even hymns about it. When the storms of life are raging, stand by me. That the storms represent difficult things that happen in life. And sometimes difficult things happen because of choices that we've made. Sometimes difficult things happen not of any choice or decision that we've made. It's just the way that life is sometimes. And storms generally represent that. Well, here's a real storm. There's a storm on the Sea of Galilee. There could be 6-8 foot waves that are ready to swamp the boat, and their lives are in danger, and so they're very much afraid. And Jesus is asleep. And so they wake him up, and he calms the storm down. He looks at them, and he says, where's your faith? How is it possible that after all you've seen, that you don't believe that I've got this, that I'm in control even of this? And it reminded me of in my own life, the storms that I face and the trouble that I've had through no decision or no fault of my own. It's just stuff that comes upon me. There's always been this one verse that I wanted to share with you, and I shared with the church yesterday. And it's in Paul's letter to the Corinthian church, his 2 Corinthians. And many of you may probably already know this verse in particular. And in this letter, Paul says, chapter 4, verse 7 and following, but we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Christ, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. And so we are always and forever perpetual living witnesses of Jesus Christ, and especially when trouble comes, when there is a persecution, when there is a confusion, when there is chaos, when there is the craziness of life. And so I've always remembered, I've always carried it with me. When trouble comes my way, I know that my Lord has gotten me through it in the past. And so though I am confused sometimes, I don't despair. I'm not at the end. I'm not over the edge of the cliff. I am troubled sometimes, but God has gotten me through it. And what I've learned, especially learned in the last few years, is that when Paul talks about this, almost inevitably, he talks about it in a pluralistic language. I've always kind of dealt with my problems in my own way, in my own time, and by myself, and been able to, God and I have been able to handle pretty much everything that's thrown our way. But when Paul writes this verse, he doesn't say, I have this treasure in a jar of clay. He says, we have a treasure in the jar of clay. And I wanted to tell you today that when it comes to the question, where's your faith, there's always more power in we than there is in me. And my faith is strengthened by the decision I make to be surrounded by a body of believers. Anytime that a person decides that they're going to try to do their faith on their own, I'm pretty sure they're going to fail. It's an almost impossible task. Only a rare individual can strengthen faith without believers surrounding them. It's the power of the church. It's the proverb, iron sharpens iron. We help each other in our journey. Come stand along, and one holds the other up, the other then holds the other up, and and on it goes, and it's all the time. And so when I realized that Paul was talking about the treasure being plural, that within the power of the fellowship of believers, there's greater ability to recognize the treasure of faith that's inside of us, and to strengthen that power that's in us, that gains strength as we come together. I went back and looked at the story in Luke again, and it's fascinating to me how the Spirit works, and sometimes different things jump out and stand out. And this time, after I realized that Paul was talking about faith as a we experience, I went back and I looked at this again. And when they get ready to get in the boat, Jesus says to them, let us go to the other side of the boat. And it's a we experience. And so I looked it up. When he says, where is your faith? I looked it up. It's a plural. He's talking to them as a group. He's not talking to them one at a time. Where's your faith? Where's your faith? He's talking to them as a group. Where's y'all's faith? You should be stronger than this together. And it ended up being great power for me to realize that, kind of no matter what I face, but even more, no matter what Wesley as a church faces, or no matter what any church I've ever served faces, or what any group of people face, that Jesus is in the boat and he's sleeping. And there's such a great lesson in that, to have tremendous confidence in the sovereignty of God and what God has in mind and in store for our tomorrow. He's sovereign over these things. And things happen in life that are confusing and sometimes painful, and they hurt. And we don't despair, though, because we have Christ in our boat with us. He's gotten us through things before. He'll do it again, and we know that. And so our faith is actually strengthened. And when we're in the boat with Jesus, and then we're also in the boat with other believers, I think Peter and James and John, they probably should have looked at each other and said, hey, this guy just raised somebody from the dead. Let's ask him what's going on, instead of being scared to death for our lives. And maybe the best answer to the biggest stress of life is to keep your eye on Jesus. Model the mentor. And what he does, he knows there's a storm coming. He falls asleep. He's got absolute authority over the natural order of things. Complete and total authority. He's on purpose and on mission. And when you're living your life on purpose and on mission, nothing can thwart that. Nothing's going to destroy that. Nothing's going to ruin that in the midst of your life. God is using you, he's using me, he's using us to accomplish something. And so a couple things for us to take home in the midst of our lives. First, we all have trouble. Everybody has trouble. I have trouble, and sometimes we, the collective we, are up against some really problematic issues. Remember, first, Jesus is in the boat. And when Jesus is in the boat, you keep your eye on Jesus and you trust in him and in what he has in mind. Second, God is sovereign. You know, if you're on purpose and on mission, the sovereignty of God is going to rule, and it may or may not turn out in a way that you think is right, but God's still going to rule. And so I would encourage you to have great confidence in God, kind of no matter what happens, have tremendous confidence in the Lord Jesus Christ. And it's not offensive for Jesus to ask someone like me or someone like us, where's your faith? Well, we're up against it. We're not really sure it's going to really turn out the way that we think. Well, of course you're not sure, but you know what? God is sure, and God is certain. And so he's sovereign over whatever is going to happen. And the final thing that I would say to you as we kind of go through this, always remember, there is greater strength in we than there is in me. And anybody who's made a decision, for whatever reason, that they're going to try to live out their faith without the assistance of other believers or without pulling up next to other believers, they're probably kidding themselves. That is not an easy row to hoe. And in fact, it's fraught with lots and lots of problems. And so I would encourage you, if you have not, at this point in your life, if you're not connected to a group of believers who can help you in your journey, you really need to do that. That's one of the most critical things that I would be able to teach anyone, is get together with other believers so you can sharpen your faith and get your roots down deep, and so you can actually help other people in their journey, and they can in turn help you. So Jesus says a couple things in closing. First, it's important that we model him and go to the other side of the lake and meet people who are not like us, meet people who may make us anxious or even nervous, and get involved in their lives. And the second thing is, know where your faith is rooted and bound. Have an opportunity to be together. Make sure you remember the we is stronger than the me.